Today I want to go over just briefly borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder, BPD, also known as emotionally unstable personality disorder. There's some perhaps changes in the works to change the name from borderline personality disorder, as some people feel that it stigmatizes the person suffering from this difficulty. And so one of the suggested possibilities is emotionally unstable personality disorder. Basically, you have someone with BPD who is suffering from an unstable and highly chaotic personality, especially in their mood swings. And usually those mood swings are not associated with circumstances in their life. They're not consistent with the things around them. So they can swing from everything is great to everything is dismal. The world is perfect, and now the world is going quickly to destruction. People are either all good or all bad. You are perfect, you are evil. I love you, I hate you. And it's this back and forth pendulum swing that makes it very difficult for those around the person with BPD to relate to them, because there's no way to predict what person you're going to receive. Today you may be the good person who's perfect and great. Tomorrow you may be the most evil person on the planet and they hate you, and there's been no context, no change to make that reasonable or understandable. So basically you've got an unstable, highly chaotic mood swings. You have extreme anger, often is the indicative here, extreme anger with no context to justify the anger. The person is just ballistic with anger, and you're trying to figure out why, what happened. Know of a particular case where a family member perhaps had something along these lines, but essentially what would happen is whoever showed up last was the good person. So someone shows up to visit, they're the first person there. Well, they're good until the second person shows up. And now a switch takes place. The first person who arrived is now the bad person, and the new person who arrived is now the good person. And so this person with the difficulty would say, oh good, you're here to help me. They're trying to kill me. And then a third person would come. Now those two are in a conspiracy to kill them, and that person is now the good person. And there's no rhyme or reason to it in many ways. It's just this quick transference, this black and white thinking about people without real proper context to it. So extreme outbursts of anger with no proper context, extremely unpredictable, and often this idea of splitting is there, this all or nothing thinking, black and white thinking, mostly as it relates to people, how they are perceived and judged. So 1 minute the person that's trying to help them is there to save them, and they'll say things like, I love you, and you're here to rescue me, and I just can't live without you. But then suddenly, because they can't draw a clear line between their identity and this person that now they suddenly love's identity, they get afraid. And to deal with the anxiety and to create distance, they don't move just a little bit down the scale. They run all the way to the other end of the scale, and they say, no, you're here to kill me, aren't you? You hate me. And so now they're suddenly in the bad area, and then sometimes it'll cycle back. No, I can't think about that. If they're bad and we have this relationship, then maybe I'm bad, and I don't want to be bad, so no, they're good now. And it goes around and around and around. This idea of splitting is there. When we think in terms of treatment for people with BPD, one of the most important things to remember is to maintain control, self-control in the situation, and don't get upset by anything that the patient says or does. So the person who has this, you know that they don't have a lot of control, that this is what you're in store for, and as you go to work with them, they're going to say and do things that ordinarily from other people on the street would be highly inflammatory and aggressive and upsetting. You must maintain control and not get upset about anything they say or anything they do, realizing that this is part of what they're struggling with and you're there to help them. Next, you need to establish rules and guidelines, clear rules and guidelines. We're going to work together, and here's behavior I will not accept and things I will not accept, and here are the consequences if you breach these rules and guidelines. And so establish the rules and guidelines, spell them out clearly, and then spell out your expectations. I expect you to talk to me and to sit here quietly and to behave in this particular form or fashion, and then be firm. Once you've established the expectations, establish the rules and guidelines, be firm. Don't be harsh, but be firm. The person will probably try to test, is this really what you mean? And as long as you back it up kindly but firmly, often they'll get the point. Remember, you're still dealing with someone who, at least in their emotions, is highly chaotic, and yet they understand these sorts of things. So you maintain control, you establish rules and guidelines, you spell out the expectations, you're firm with those, and then you want to set a consistent schedule. Consistent scheduling actually helps in the process. Okay, we're going to meet every other day at 3. And so every other day at 3, you've got to be there. They kind of count on that. That sort of regularity assists them. And then finally, when they do make progress, when they do keep within the bounds of the expectations, the rules, and the guidelines, reward them and give them positive reinforcement. Rewards and positive reinforcement go a long way towards helping them. It takes time, but they can be helped. So this has just been a cursory overview of some of the things related to borderline personality disorder. One, the possible name change to emotionally unstable personality disorder, the unpredictable nature of it, the idea of splitting, all or nothing thinking, you're either all good or you're all bad. And then some of the treatment overview here that can be very beneficial and helpful. If you'd like to learn more about this and related topics, underneath this video you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website with that information. And while you're at that website, you should find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download. Wanted to go over some of the concepts that are critical to counseling. These are by no means all the concepts that you need in counseling, but they are important factors when we think about the effectiveness of counseling. And I want to go over the 4 that are on the board and talk about them briefly. So the first concept in counseling that we want to talk about is attending. Attending refers to the counselor's verbal and nonverbal communication with the client. This basically is nodding of the head, a smile, subvocalizations, including words, please continue, things like this. Any sort of audible or visual communication to the client by the counselor that indicates that the counselor is attending to what the client is saying. This is very important because if the counselor gives no indication to the client of paying attention, then the client tends to lose hope that you don't really care, no one cares, this isn't doing me any good. And so it's important that one of the most important concepts for the counselor to communicate to the client is, I am attending to your words, I am engaged in what you're saying, I am interested, so that they might feel at ease, comfortable, and be drawn out to give further disclosure. So attending is a very critical and important concept in counseling. Once again, it's both visual, nodding of the head, smiles, and auditory, subvocalizations, that's interesting, words continued, I understand, things like this. Verbal and nonverbal communication that get the client to communicate further. The second concept we want to go over is immediacy. Immediacy. This concept refers to things that as the client is opening up and talking, something may be brought up in the conversation that the counselor needs to key in on immediately, right away, stop everything else and deal with that situation that's come up. And you've got to be listening and attending to know when those things come up and be able to recognize them so that when the issue is brought forward, you immediately stop everything else and deal with that issue. It's that critical. It's that important. There are some things that may seem tangential or insignificant to the client as they bring them up, but if the counselor keys in on that and says that is really critical, and even if it seems superfluous on the outside, on the perimeter of what the client's really trying to deal with, the counselor needs to immediately stop the client and deal and focus in on that particular issue. So immediacy, knowing what's important and being willing to stop the client where they are and deal solely with that particular issue of critical importance instead of putting it off till later. Immediacy. And then next we want to look at expertness. Expertness. In this counseling concept, what we're trying to say here is that the counselor needs to know what they are competent to deal with and what they're not competent to deal with. If they are competent to deal with something, they should say so and do it with confidence. They should not, however, pretend or act as if they can help someone out of sympathy or tenderness of heart when they really have no idea how to help the person. If it were to come to light by the client, from the counselor, that they really don't know what they're doing, this completely undermines the whole process and keeps the client from feeling any sort of confidence that they can get the help they need. So know what you know and also know what you don't know. And be willing to say, I don't know, but I will help find someone for you that can help you deal with that problem. I know you're tender-hearted, but to say, I really want to help this person, I don't know how to, but I'll act like I know how to, really just hurts them in the long run. Get them to someone who really knows how to help with that particular situation. That's the best thing you can do. So know what you know what you don't know. Don't pretend to know something you don't know in order to help someone. Be an expert in your field, pass someone off to other experts in their field, when something comes up. And then finally, evaluating. And this is one of the most important concepts for a counselor. You want to be helping people, but if you're not evaluating, you don't know whether you're providing help or not. And so you need to, from time to time, both by yourself and perhaps with the client as well, spend some time evaluating whether or not progress is being made, whether or not the help that is needed is being brought to bear. So basically, in this case, it is the counselor's appraisal of the counseling process. And then that may include feedback from the client. If it looks as if no progress is being made, then you may need to look elsewhere or even refer them on to someone else. But without that evaluation, neither one of you, the client nor the counselor, will know if you're really making forward progress. It can be slow progress, that's fine. But if no progress is being made, because the evaluation determines that, something else needs to be tried and need to move on. So these are 4 critical counseling concepts that you need to know. There are obviously more concepts that are important in their own right related to counseling, but remember, attending, both the visual and auditory clues that I am clued into what you're saying, I'm listening, I'm with you, immediacy, stopping, breaking in when something critical comes up, expertness, know what you know what you don't know, and then evaluating, which is taking time to appraise, is this really helpful or not? If you'd like to look at this and learn more or other concepts related to this, underneath this video there's a link. Click on it, it'll take you to a website with that information, and while you're there, you'll find another link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download. There's an age-old question that goes back to what affects people. Is it nature or nurture? This question basically asks, what is determinative in a person becoming who they are? Are they born that way or are they raised that way? If they're considered to be born that way, then we'd say nature is paramount. If they are raised that way, then we would say nurture is paramount. So in the age-old question of nature, nurture, the real answer is both. That there are factors, both biological and societal, that are factors in a person's development, both biological and social. And we want to talk a little bit about social factors today as it relates to the development of people from childhood through adolescence to adulthood, and how each one of those social factors provides an influence one way or another as development takes place. And so I've got 5 up here on the board. There's obviously more factors than that play into it, but these 5 represent major areas of development, major factors in the development of a person. So we begin with parents. Parents are a very strong determinative factor. From parents come care and concern, nurture. Parents give ideas. They promote values. They give by their own practice patterns of behavior. They can even instill habits in their children. So parents are a strong social factor when we talk about the development of a child. Now, there are different parenting styles, from authoritarian to permissive, and based on where they are on that continuum, that can have a strong impact on a child's development based on the parenting style of the parent. Next, peers also provide a very strong factor in the development of a child. From the earliest time that children start to socialize with one another, they are picking up, once again, ideas, patterns of behavior, likes and dislikes to varying degrees. They are learned from other children. And as the child develops, especially into the teenage years and adolescence, peer pressure, the pressure of those in their own age group to conform, becomes very strong and a heightened factor in the development of that child. Peer pressure through teenage years and adolescence produces a very strong factor in the development of a child. Next, society. Ways that the child interacts with society. This would include things like church, neighborhoods, schools. These all provide sources for ideas, feedback, positive and negative, to a child as to their behavior, their thought patterns, things like this. Society provides, based on how it comes to them, neighborhood, church, schools, standards, values, beliefs, other influences that come in. So we've seen that some of the close influences include parents from the earliest days on, peers starting at childhood and then ramping up through teenage, adolescent years, a society, depending on how there's interaction there, based in schools, churches, neighborhoods, things like this. Next, the media also provides a very strong factor in the development of a child. Sources of media include music, television, the internet, any way that outside ideas and information is then brought into the sphere of this particular child or individual in various forms and modes. Media can have a very strong impact, especially when it's a combined media like TV or the internet, where there's a visual component combined with an auditory component. Of course, the strongest one here being TV. But you can find this on the internet as well, and certainly in other sources. But audio and visual components brought together to display to this child or this person, once again, ideas, modes of behavior, things that encourage or discourage certain behaviors. This has a strong developmental factor on an individual. And then finally, gender identity. Most people's gender identity matches with their biological gender from birth on, but from the earliest times, children are figuring out how they feel and who they are. And once again, it's both biological and social. So there is a biological gender, but there's also what is encouraged or discouraged societally as well. And as the child learns their way through the world, these factors from parents, peers, society, media, all play an impact on that gender identity, either reinforcing or discouraging from the identity that the child is forming. And they all play a factor in that. So in this one especially, nature and nurture come together. And it is a strong factor in development, how a child, and then going up through adolescence, teen years, and adult, sees and thinks about themselves. Once again, it's either reinforcing or discouraging a particular gender identity. It's not 100% fluid, but there does seem to be, at least in the early formative years, some sense of fluidity there based on what each one of these factors brings to bear on that particular case. Anyway, these are some of the main factors in the development of a child. Remember, it's both nature and nurture, both biological and social. We looked at primarily social influencers here today. If you'd like to learn more, you can click on the link that's underneath this video. It'll take you to the website with that information. And while you're at that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
Generalized anxiety disorder is more common in women, usually noted with the onset in their 20s and 30s. Symptoms chiefly include abnormally high levels of concern about a variety of issues. This concern occupies the majority of the patient's time for at least 6 months. These worries lead to impairment in daily activities such as work, school, or childcare. Other manifestations of this disorder include physical complaints such as insomnia, body aches, gastrointestinal disturbance, headaches, and others. Diagnosis requires careful history taking and exclusion of other disorders that may mimic this presentation. Of note, other psychiatric disorders may be present with similar components, including post-traumatic stress disorder and major depressive disorder. Medical disease must also be considered but ruled out as a cause of the physical symptoms. Benzodiazepine are the cornerstone of treatment for generalized anxiety disorder. Longer-acting benzodiazepine are preferred. Clonazepam and SSRIs are used for long-term treatment.
In today's video, we're going to go briefly and touch lightly upon Dr. Freud's theory of personality as it relates to the id and the ego and the way they interact. If we want to look at this model, we're talking about a psychological model of the structure of the mind. This does not correspond to places in the brain or to anything about us physiologically. You can't point to a part of the body or the brain and say that's where the id is, and that's where the ego is, and that's where the superego is. This has to do with our mind and Freud's theory about how people live and interact with the world. And he saw 3 different forces at work within people. He said that we are all born with this basic identity of pleasure seeking, or the id. The id is entirely consumed with self-gratification. If I'm hungry, I want food now. If I am uncomfortable, I want to be made comfortable now. It just wants to meet its needs. It is heedless and regardless of reality going on around it, of other people's needs, of other people's wants, whether it hurts someone else. And Freud would say this is seen most clearly in babies. If they're hungry, they cry. They get fed, they stop crying. If they have a dirty diaper, they cry. If they get changed and are made physically comfortable, they stop crying. If they're sleepy, they cry, and you put them to sleep, they stop crying. So it's whatever they need immediately, that's the id. This is the innate, born into us, selfish nature that says, I want what I want, and I want it now. It's the aggressive part of us, the pleasure-seeking part of us. It's all of our basic drives, hunger, sex, aggression, whatever. All those basic drives come out and are part of the id, and this is from birth. Then Freud said, around about the age 3, the ego starts to develop, and it's the ego's job to satisfy as much as possible the desires of the id while taking into account the reality around it. So by 3, the child is starting to realize that there are other people who also have wants, desires, and needs. It is also starting to realize that if it immediately tries to gratify itself, sometimes that leads to pain. And in order to maximize pain, the ego develops to satisfy the needs of the id while taking into account reality, other people's, other needs, other wants, and the best way, given the current state of affairs, the current reality, to prolong pleasure and to minimize pain. So the ego develops to moderate the id, but also to more adequately and over the long haul satisfy the id. So the ego's job, once again, is to meet the needs of the id. The id says, I want, I want, I want. The ego comes along and says, okay, you want, but here's the reality of the situation. In order for you to get what you want, we're going to have to withhold here, restrain here, pursue this, that, there. And that will lead to long-term pleasure, although it will sometimes hamper short-term gain. And we're going to want to avoid the short-term pleasure seeking, as it may lead to more long-term pain later. And then around about the age 5, Freud said the superego starts to develop. This is the part that we would ordinarily call the conscience. It doesn't deal with the real, but more the ideal, what ought to be, the way things should be. And basically there's this conflict then between the superego, which says this is the way things ought to be based on the morality of society, and the id, which says I want this now, and the ego stands between seeking to rationalize, harmonize, and satisfy both poles. Society says this is the way things ought to be. I want this. Here's the way things are right now in reality. How can I keep the superego quiet, keep my conscience placated, and get what I want without long-term hurt based on the reality of the situation now? So the ego is the one who interacts between these opposing forces, but its primary job is to meet the needs of the id, those primal drives of hunger, aggression, intimacy, things like this, to meet those needs, but in a way that deals with reality. So remember, the id is the basic drives. It's based on pleasure, and it wants it now. Pleasure and aggression, basic drives, born with it. The ego is based on the reality principle. This is the way things are really happening right now. This is the current circumstance. How am I going to meet the current circumstance, satisfy the needs of the id, but not produce prolonged pain? So satisfies the id based on reality. The superego is the conscience and deals not with the real, but with the ideal, the way things ought to be as it is informed by the current culture and society. Born with the id, age 3, the ego starts to develop. Age 5, the superego starts to develop unless there are hindrances to that development. This is Freud's theory, then, of the interaction of the id and the ego. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has that information. While you're at that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download. Today I want to talk a little bit about Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, OCD. Of course, one of the jokes related to this, if you're really OCD, it should read CDO. It's got to be in alphabetical order. But all joking aside, it is a serious disorder that can hamper people's life, and it is characterized by the recurrence of unwanted or distressing thoughts, the need to repeat behaviors or rituals, and it can get to the point where it gets in the way of someone's normal living, from their ability to perform their job or other ordinary functions, and that they begin to realize that these thoughts or these behaviors are not ordinary or normal. They're not reasonable, and they get in the way of daily activity. Usually these characteristics, their typical onset is in childhood or adolescence, as it shows up in, once again, the recurrence of the distressing thoughts or the repetitious behaviors. And usually when we think about this recurrence of unwanted distressing thoughts, one of the things that comes to mind that's fairly common to most people, but in someone with OCD would be all-consuming, would be the idea of, did I leave the iron on? Did I forget to turn off the stove? Are the lights still on? Did I lock the doors? Okay, these are ordinary things that we sometimes forget and think about, and then we go check and we're okay, or we can move on. Someone with OCD, though, has the recurrence of this unwanted questioning over and over and over and over and over again, to the point that they actually can't do anything else but think and worry about, did I lock the door? Did I lock the door? Did I lock the door? Is the iron off? Is the iron off? Is the iron off? And they've actually got to repeatedly check, and even after they've checked, the thought is still there and they have to go back and recheck. The thought is still there and they go back and recheck. And it's this distressing situation that causes the most problems. Now, it's not just those ordinary thoughts that we think of that come back repetitiously. Sometimes they include thoughts that are distressing or disturbing because of the nature of the thoughts that repetitiously come up. I might hurt someone, or have I hurt someone physically in some way or another, and it comes up repeatedly. I might hurt someone, or I have hurt someone, or I want to hurt someone. Anyway, it's the repetition of these unwanted, distressing thoughts that are part of the obsessive nature of the disorder. The compulsion comes in under the behavior, the need to repeat behaviors or rituals. This would be the endlessly arranging things in a particular order, obsessing over and consistently feeling a compulsion to put things precisely where they belong. Ritualistic behaviors that have to be repeated before anything can be done further. The constant washing of hands. The constant counting of things. Things that are, once again, seen to be not necessarily reasonable, and they inhibit or interfere with daily activities. So the obsessive thoughts, the compulsive behavior get in the way, and usually treatment for this involves cognitive behavioral therapy and antidepressants to try to get the person to deal with whatever it is that they're stuck on mentally that's compelling or moving them forward into these obsessive thoughts or this compulsive behavior. There is help for those who have this, thankfully. And if you'd like to learn more about OCD and the things we've talked about here just briefly, you will find a link underneath this video. Click on it. It'll take you to a website with more information. And on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download. Those that are tasked with helping people make productive changes to their life, dealing with the pain and the stress and the hurt of dysfunctional life, have various approaches to, one, identifying problems, and two, finding a solution to those problems. One of the ways to both identify and help solve problems is the psychoanalytic approach. The psychoanalytic approach is also called the psychodynamic intervention approach, and it basically follows the following tenets. Just briefly, I want to just talk about the few feeder views that feed into this view so that you have maybe a broader idea of where it comes from. So the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic intervention approach draws upon psychoanalytic theory, ego psychology theory, psychosocial theory, and object relations theory. So all of those things are drawn together and coalesce in this psychoanalytic approach. The key tenets that we want to talk about is, number one, the social environment in which the person exists is considered the primary external influence. Nothing is greater as an influence externally to the person than their social environment. So you must know the environment in which they're in and get all the information you can there to realize what external factors are feeding into the equation and causing the dysfunction and the problems. Second, behavior, how people act, flows from the unconscious mind and unconscious drive. So in many ways, they don't know why they're doing what they're doing. It's flowing out of the unconscious mind, drives, motives, and those sorts of things. But their behavior flows out of that. So you've got the external factors of the social environment, and then internally, these unknown motives and drives from the unconscious mind. Next, dysfunction comes about by the stress produced through conflicts in the unconscious mind. So stress-producing experience and conflicts in the unconscious mind express themselves in dysfunctional behavior. So you've got the external influences of the social environment, you've got motives and drives coming from the unconscious mind producing behavior. Dysfunctional behavior shows that there is stressful conditions, that there is conflict-causing experiences in the unconscious mind then being acted out in dysfunctional behavior. Finally, if you're going to get resolution to this, what you have to do is draw out the unconscious mind into the conscious mind. What's going on with them in places they don't know subconsciously, drawing that out into the open, into the conscious mind. By doing that, you actually produce stress. The reason it's in the unconscious mind is because they don't want to deal with it. And in some ways, the stress and the conflict has pushed it there. You draw it out, and you use the energy created from the stress and the conflict as it comes into the conscious mind to help produce changes. So you would talk them through it and say, look, I know this is painful, I know this is hard, let's do something about it. Let's actually use that energy productively to bring about a good change in your behavior, changes in your thoughts, changes in your behavior, changes in your environment so that things start moving in a good direction. So the key factors to remember here again in the psychoanalytic approach is that the primary external influence is always the social environment. All of our behavior flows from motives and drives found in our unconscious mind. Dysfunctional behavior is produced by stress-producing experiences and conflict in the unconscious mind, and the way to help alleviate that or change that or bring about good is to take the things that are in the unconscious mind, bring them forth into the conscious mind. It's stress-producing to do that, but then you help them use that energy from that stress to redirect them and promote positive changes in their life and their behavior. If you'd like to learn more about this, you can click on the link underneath this video. That link will take you to a website with that information, and also on that website, you'll find there a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
I'd like to talk about how to solve a problem even when you're not 100% sure of what the correct answer is, just by using clues that are provided to you in the answer choices. You may be surprised, but the answer choices themselves, even the incorrect ones, can also give clues that lead to the correct answer choice. Let's take a look at this one. This is a problem where you're asked to put together a group, and you're given some details, and you're told certain things about the group and asked to identify what type of group this is. Is it either A, a heterogeneous closed group, B, a homogeneous open group, C, a homogeneous closed group, or D, a homogeneous open or closed group? And so we kind of have two different things. First, whether the group is homogeneous or heterogeneous, and then whether it's an open, closed, or in this case, open or closed group. So first, let's just look at this first part of the answer choices. As you can see, 3 of them say homogeneous and only 1 says heterogeneous. And so it's likely that the correct answer choice is going to be one of these 3 because again, the writer of the test questions and the answer choices is trying to trick you up and have answer choices that are close to the correct one but not quite the correct one, which by having some of the information in the answer choice being correct, but not all of it, makes you likely to get tricked, and if you don't really understand what's being asked, you might miss it. But here we're just trying to see what we can identify. Now going to the second half of the answer choices, we have closed here, open, closed, and then open or closed. So you have open in here twice in B and D. You have closed in here 3 times in A, C, and D. And so that's going to be the majority of choices in that part of the answer choice. And so if we're looking for something that pairs it up the best, and we say that since open is in here twice, which is less good, and if we cancel those out, you're going to be left with choice C. D would be in contention but for the fact that it contains open, which is only in here 1 other time. The best overall one is going to be C. And so if you're forced into a situation where you have to guess, you want to do it in an educated fashion, and this allows you to quickly kind of move through an answer choice and make a decision. And it can be particularly helpful if you have it narrowed down. If you know it's either B or C but not D, then that might further allow you to eliminate some choices and get the correct answer.
In conducting social work with specific ethnic groups, there are several things that need to be kept in mind in order to provide the best care for that person in need. So when we think about social work with a specific ethnic group, the first thing we need to be aware of is the most up-to-date code of ethics for whatever agency you happen to be serving at the time. What is their code of ethics? Am I aware of it? Am I abiding by it? Am I consistent with it? So you need that information to begin with, so that you are providing ethical care and ethical help within the confines of the group that you are serving. So you must have the knowledge of the most up-to-date code of ethics as they pertain to the distribution of services to specific groups. Next, if you're doing social work with anybody, but with specific ethnic groups as well, you need to be aware of not only the typical human responses to stress, but also perhaps specific responses of specific ethnic groups related to stress. What are those typical responses of every human being, and then perhaps the specific responses of a particular ethnic group to stress? To be aware of those so that you know what to expect based on not only the general population, but the specific group that you're seeking to help. Next, you need to be aware of the policies and services offered by your agencies. Whatever agency you're serving, what are its policies and related to providing help for this ethnic group? What are the services offered to this particular ethnic group? Need to be aware of everything that's at your disposal, not only within your agency, but in other agencies that may be connected to it, so that you know the whole range of things that are available. So being aware of and knowledgeable of the policies and the services offered is critical. So you've got generic background information, code of ethics, typical human responses, and specific responses to that ethnic group, policies and services offered. And then you need to have personal awareness. What is my ethnic background, and how is the way I was raised and my own thoughts and feelings, not only towards my own ethnicity, but to other ethnicities, going to come into play as I seek to provide help and care. So self-awareness is critical as well. Self-assessment might lead you to say, perhaps this is better done by someone else, and I need to take some time to work on myself here, get myself in a position where I can provide the best possible care to people. Through our own upbringing and other things, prejudices sometimes can be there, perhaps dormant, and they suddenly come to the surface. They definitely need to be dealt with. So along with the background information, you need to be aware of yourself as well, and your own upbringing and how your own ethnicity plays into how you help others. Then next, do a realistic assessment of the social environment in which the problem has arisen. A realistic assessment. We want to emphasize that word there, realistic assessment. I know we all want to think the best, and sometimes we look at a situation and say it's the worst. Make a realistic assessment of the circumstances and situation that has led to the need for the intervention or the help. So you've taken a look then at the environment specific to the client, and you therefore are able to facilitate a proper resolution to the problem. So you're going to get a proper resolution to the problem by having a realistic assessment of the social environment related to that particular person that you're seeking to help. 6, you need to look at the root causes of why there is going to be participation in the intervention, and is the person participating voluntarily or involuntarily in the services offered. So what has led to this intervention, and is the person participating voluntarily or involuntarily? Those are critical things to be aware of because it will affect the way you try to provide the help and what you're able to do, and perhaps it broadens or limits your options, and especially if there's an involuntary participation. So what led to the intervention, and is the person participating voluntarily or involuntarily? And then finally, number 7, identify the stresses and supports unique to that ethnic group that you're seeking to help. So what are the stresses unique to that ethnic group, but what are the supports perhaps that are also unique to that ethnic group? And be willing to be an advocate, not just for one group, but for all those in the community that are needing the support and help that is provided by the agency that you are serving. So these are just basically 7 things to be aware of, 7 elements, if you will, that prepare the worker to work with specific ethnic groups, but they're obviously applicable across the board as well. But if you're going to work with a specific ethnic group, be aware of the background situations, be aware of yourself, make a realistic assessment of the social environment. Why was the intervention called for? Is the person or group participating voluntarily or involuntarily? And then finally, what are the stresses and supports unique to that group? And be willing to be an advocate for all those involved in the area. Anyway, if you'd like to learn more about this or related things, underneath this video you'll find a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website with that information. And while you're on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download. Stress. It's something that every human being goes through at one point in their life or another, often multiple times, and sometimes over a prolonged period. The universal human response to stress has been dubbed the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS for short. It has 3 stages. The General Adaptation Syndrome, or the GAS response to stress, has 3 stages, and we're going to go over those now. The first stage is called stimulation. At this stage, the stress has been introduced to the person, and their body responds by the hypothalamus stimulating the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine or adrenaline. Epinephrine and adrenaline are the same thing depending on what part of the world you're in. They're going to favor one or the other. Epinephrine is the Greek-derived word for this hormone, and adrenaline is the Latin-derived word for this hormone, but they're the same thing. So the hypothalamus stimulates the adrenal medulla and releases epinephrine. The glucose level rises, the heart and respiration rates increase, and the individual becomes alarmed. We've all experienced this. Stress comes in, things heat up, adrenaline or epinephrine is released, heart rate goes up, respiration goes up, and the person is in a state of readiness, alarm, fight or flight in some ways. So the GAS response then is managed by the adrenal and the pituitary gland. So the first level then is stimulation. If the stress is not resolved at this level, then the second stage that the General Adaptation Syndrome goes to is resistance. At this stage, the body resists the stress by returning respiration and heart rates to baseline. The hypothalamus commands the pituitary gland to release ACTH, a hormone that causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Cortisol is a chemical that maintains high levels of blood glucose. So this is once again the body's attempt to deal with whatever is bringing about the stress. So stimulation puts a person in an alarmed or heightened state. It persists, resistance comes in, the body trying to bring things into line, into a normal state. Once again, the hypothalamus is critical to all this. In the initial stage, it stimulates the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine. In the next state, it commands the pituitary gland to release the hormone ACTH, which causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol to keep the blood glucose levels high. Finally, if the stress is not resolved, the third stage for the general adaptation or GAS syndrome is exhaustion. Here, the pituitary and adrenal glands are utterly fatigued. The physiological processes start to break down. And it is this stage right here, this exhaustion stage, that if it is prolonged is most damaging to health. So stress management is extremely important. Stress comes into everyone's life. The universal response of every human being experiencing various levels of stress has been generalized as the GAS adaptation or the General Adaptation Syndrome. It has 3 stages: stimulation, resistance, and then exhaustion, this stage being the most damaging to health. The hypothalamus involved in this. First stage, releasing epinephrine. Second stage, releasing ACTH in order to get cortisol to come out and raise the blood glucose levels. And then finally, when the pituitary and adrenal glands are utterly fatigued, everything begins to break down and the health begins to deteriorate. If you'd like to read more and learn more about stress and find out exploration more in this area, then please click on the link beneath this video. It'll take you to a website where you can study further, and you'll also find an ebook there ready for immediate download. Today we're going to talk a little bit about autism and some of the symptoms that are indicative of autism. Now, the first thing we want to note is that the symptoms for autism are wide and complex, and it's not easy always to tell that autism is there unless many of these symptoms are present in one child. So remember, this is a general overview of the kind of symptoms that are seen when a child has autism, but that the overriding issue is that the signs and symptoms of autism are wide, diverse, and complex. Usually, by age 3, if a child has autism, these signs or symptoms become evident. They can be noted in the child. What is noticed usually is that the child is making ordinary progress up to about age 3, and then suddenly there is a regress in abilities. So normal progress towards age 3, and then suddenly a regress in that progress. So cognitive distortion begins to show itself at this point. Things that they were learning, they suddenly don't seem to know anymore. Language skill is definitely not present. They're not making good progress in that. And we have that down here. Basically, there's a language delay. And in that language delay, what you tend to notice is an echoing back of things that are heard, but no meaningful conversation, no interaction. It's as if what you're saying doesn't really register so that they're responding to it. It's just like you pushed record and it was recorded, and then you pushed play and it came right back at you without it seeming to register. So progress and then regress in cognitive distortion. You'll also notice an uneven distribution of intellectual competence. So there'll be high competence in some areas and yet no competence in others, and there's no balance there at all. So ordering things, numbering things, counting things may be off the chart. You're like, wow, my child's brilliant, going to be a mathematician. And yet language skills, social skills, and other things seem to be utterly non-existent. This is one of those wide and complex symptoms related to autism then. Uneven distribution of intellectual competence, progress in some areas, and in that area suddenly regress. Then you get repetitive or stereotypic motions, Why they would do the same thing over and over again is once again related to the autism, that they get comfort from that, or it's just a part of their world. Those with autism are often described as being in their own world, and this is actually the case. In their mind, this makes sense in their world, this repetitive motion. And once again, it brings comfort. So this is noted in them, that they would just sit perhaps for hours doing the same motion over and over and over again, without really understanding that they were doing it over and over and over again. You also get a distorted sensory perception. In this type of complex of symptoms, what you would have is the child is touched lightly and there is a pulling away, as if it were painful, the lightest touch being painful. Touch that would normally bring a sense of comfort or pleasure, a caress, is perceived as hurtful or painful, and the child retreats from it. And it's not 100% understood why, but what would ordinarily be seen as a comforting motion, a hug and things like this, is rejected by the child with autism as being uncomfortable to them and perhaps even painful. So a distortion of their sensory perception. We talked about language display, but there's also a fascination with flickering lights, that a child can be completely honed in on that and look at these flickering lights without end, just utterly fascinated with it and not bored with it at all. I mean, they wouldn't actually even leave the situation saying, well, that's interesting, now I'm going to do something else. They can't really even hardly be distracted from it either. So a fascination with flickering lights, the language delay, an echoing back of what they hear, and then perhaps what is most difficult for the parents of children with autism is there's little or no connection to caregivers, little or no emotional connection, a recognition of receiving affection or reciprocating affection. They literally are in their own world and seem completely oblivious to what's going on around them, and not able to receive affection, physical, verbal, or otherwise. And all these things add up to be symptoms of autism. Now, there obviously are more symptoms than this and other things that play into it. This has just been a brief overview of some of the symptoms of autism. If you'd like to learn more about this and related matters, there's a link underneath this video. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website with that information, and while you're there, you'll also find an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
There are several different types of depression. I've got a number of them listed on the board here. The distinguishing features are the symptoms, the severity of the symptoms, and the duration of how long they last. Three of them that are categorized by the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, an American Psychiatric Association publication. Three of those are the major depressive disorder, dysthymic disorder, and manic depression. Major depressive disorder, also known as major depression or clinical depression, has symptoms that last for most of the day, nearly every day, for at least 2 weeks. And it must have a number of additional symptoms such as significant weight loss, difficulty in sleeping, difficulty thinking, excessive feelings of guilt. Dysthymic disorder refers to a nearly constant depressed mood for at least 2 years with additional symptoms such as eating problems, sleeping problems, low energy, fatigue, low self-esteem. Manic depression includes periods of mania and depression, and there's a cycling between these two states that is an identifying mark of this type of depression. There's manic episodes where there's inflated self-esteem, decreased need for sleep, easily distracted. Someone that's more talkative than usual characterizes this type of depression. Other types of depression, you have postpartum depression. This is very common in women after they give birth, usually beginning within 4 weeks of giving birth and varying in duration and severity. Seasonal affective disorder, also known as SAD, is a type of depressive disorder that reoccurs at a specific time of the year. Seasonal is the key word there. Typically, this would be in the fall or winter, which can be drearier months of the year. And anxiety depression is not an official depression type as defined by the DSM, but anxiety is often occurring at the same time as depression with someone, and a depressed individual that exhibits lots of anxious symptoms may be diagnosed with this. Atypical depression, which is a subtype of the major depressive disorder, is characterized by a temporary improvement in mood in reaction to positive events, in addition with other symptoms such as weight gain, oversleeping, a heavy feeling in arms and legs, and a sensitivity to rejection. Chronic depression is a major depressive episode that lasts for at least 2 years. Here we've got double depression, which is someone that has dysthymia, which is chronic mild depression, and also experiences a major depressive episode, more severe depressive symptoms lasting at least 2 weeks. Endogenous depression. Endogenous means from within the body, and this type of depression is defined as feeling depressed for no apparent reason. So there's not an external thing, it's considered to be endogenous. Situational or reactive depression, also known as adjustment disorder with depressed mood. This develops in response to a particularly stressful situation or when someone is reacting to something, typically a relationship, problems at work or school. It does not meet the criteria for a major depressive disorder, and it's something that, as given the name, is situational. Agitated depression is a kind of major depressive disorder characterized with physical, emotional restlessness, irritability, and insomnia, and is the opposite, which is the opposite of many depressed individuals who have low energy and feel slowed down physically or mentally. Psychotic depression is a major depressive episode with psychotic symptoms such as hallucinations or delusions. Melancholic depression involves a loss of pleasure in virtually all activities or mood, and mood does not temporarily improve in response to a positive event. So if something good happens to the person, you think they should be more upbeat. Someone who is suffering from melancholic depression would not experience that. Catatonic depression is another subtype of a major depressive disorder, as many of these are, and is characterized with a loss of voluntary movement, an inability to react to one's environment. You think of someone that's catatonic and they're not responding to an environment or a stimulus, and they have extreme resistance to instructions or suggestions. They may be unwilling to speak. Those would be symptoms of catatonic depression. So as you can see, there's a lot of different forms of depression. You have the three major categories here. Many of these fall under a major depressive disorder characterization, and these are all important to understand and to know the differences of what can lead to each of these.